What's going on, guys? It's Greg here, aka New York Prepper. You're watching How to Survive a Nuclear War Part 4. And in this video, I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit more about blast waves, thermal radiation, ionizing radiation, and I'm going to also talk to you guys about damage zones and radioactive zones. And we're going to take a deeper dive into some of the effects of a nuclear explosion, and I'm also going to share some information about the most common nuclear warheads and how far away you have to be to get away from some of those effects, like the blast wave, the thermal radiation, and the ionizing radiation. So sit back and relax, and I hope you guys learned something. Now, before I get into the video, I want to also remind you guys to check out part 1, part 2, and part 3 before you watch this video, because you need to have the foundations under your belt before you can get into the more advanced stuff. So watch part 1, part 2, and part 3, because the video that I'm making now builds off of those videos, and every video that I make going forward builds off of the prior videos. So if you're watching part 6, it's going to be building off of the information that I share in part 5, part 4, part 3, part 2, and part 1. Okay, so you can find all of my nuclear war survival videos in my nuclear survival playlist, and I'll leave a link up above to that playlist. So I hope you guys enjoy the video, and thanks for your support. All right, guys, so we're going to talk about damage zones. This is an important thing to understand, a very basic concept of nuclear explosions. You have different damage zones, and within those damage zones, you have different levels of damage. And there's 3 main damage zones. You have the severe damage zone, or SDZ, the moderate damage zone, or MDZ, and then you have the light damage zone, which is LDZ. And what you're looking at here is a sketch that I made of, this is an explosion of a 5 megaton Chinese Dongfeng ICBM. Okay, this is one of the ICBMs that China has currently deployed as part of their strategic nuclear arsenal. Okay, so this weapon, the Chinese Dongfeng, is actually deployed within the Chinese strategic nuclear forces, okay? So this is possibly one type of warhead that could be used against the United States in a nuclear war, okay? And so what you're looking at here are the different blast zones represented by these rings, okay? And this black dot in the middle represents the detonation point. This is the fireball, okay? This is the detonation point, the flash point, the fireball. That's what this black dot here represents. Right outside of the flash point or the detonation point, you have your severe damage zone, okay, which with the 5 megaton Chinese Dongfeng is about 3 miles, okay, from the detonation point. So it's a 3-mile radius, and it has a diameter of 6 miles. Okay, so you have to be 3 miles away minimum from the detonation point of the 5 megaton Chinese Dongfeng to escape the severe damage zone. All right, moving outside of the severe damage zone, you got the moderate damage zone, which extends 12 kilometers or 7.5 miles away from the detonation point, okay? And then outside of the moderate damage zone, you have the light damage zone, which you have to go 37 kilometers away or 23 miles away, okay, to escape the light damage zone. So the severe damage zone represents overpressures of 20 pounds per square inch. The moderate damage zone represents overpressure of 5 pounds per square inch, and the light damage zone represents 1 pound per square inch. Okay, now that doesn't sound like a lot, but the human eardrum can rupture at just 5 psi. Okay, So within the moderate damage zone, or within 7.5 miles from the detonation point, you could possibly rupture your eardrums. There's a 50% chance that you can rupture your eardrums at 5 psi of overpressure. Okay, so if you're within 7.5 miles of the flash point of this 5 megaton Chinese nuclear warhead, there's a possibility you could have ruptured eardrums. Okay, now to rupture your lungs, you need 30 psi. Okay, so if you're within the severe damage zone, there's a possibility you could even rupture your lungs. And then you have 1 psi, which is very low. 1 psi is like just enough to shatter glass. Okay, so 1 psi is equivalent to a 38 mile per hour gust of wind. Okay, so that's when the blast wave is coming through. It's going to have a 38 mile per hour wind if you're within the light damage zone. It's going to feel like a 38 mile per hour wind. So it's not that strong. It's going to be enough to break your windows and maybe carry some debris through the air, but it's not going to be enough to rupture your eardrums or flip over cars or knock down buildings. Okay, and the light damage zone goes from 7.5 miles all the way out to 23 miles with the 5 megaton Chinese Dongfeng ICBM, or 12 kilometers to 37 kilometers. So if you're within the light damage zone, you're going to experience 38 mile per hour wind. Okay, that's the blast wave. 5 psi is 163 mile per hour wind. Okay, so even just 5 psi is the equivalent of a category 5 hurricane wind gust. Okay, 163 miles per hour. So if you're within the moderate damage zone, you're going to experience at least a 5 psi wind, okay, or 163 mile per hour wind when that blast wave comes through. And that's between 3 miles and 7.5 miles, okay, or between 5 kilometers and 12 kilometers. That's the moderate damage zone. Then you have the severe damage zone, which is an area you don't want to be. That's within 3 miles of the flash point. And again, that's a 5 megaton warhead. Now, 5 megatons is a pretty big warhead, okay? That's not a small warhead. That's a larger warhead. This is probably the size of warhead that would be used to take out a large U.S. city, okay? This is probably the size of warhead that they would use. So just keep that in mind. And within the severe damage zone, you're going to have 20 psi or greater, okay? And at the actual flash point, you could have thousands of psi, okay? You could have 5,000 psi right around the flash point, like right where the bomb is detonated, okay? And that's just going to be a couple hundred meters. That's the extreme damage zone, which we're not going to have to worry about that because you can't survive the extreme damage zone at all. The extreme damage zone is just for military planners when they're figuring out how to harden their nuclear bunkers, their silos, and their doomsday bunkers. They need to know what the extreme damage zone is, so this way they can appropriately harden their bunker, okay, to withstand the PSI. But most bunkers are hardened to over 3,000 PSI, and this warhead here will probably generate a 2,000 PSI area of destruction within just a couple hundred yards, okay? So it's not a wide area of massive PSI, okay? So what I want to do now is I want to just go through some descriptions of what to expect. If you're in the SDZ, the MDZ, or the LDZ, what can you actually expect? Because these are just numbers, okay? Now again, 1 PSI, which is the light damage zone, 38 mile per hour wind from the blast wave. 5 PSI, which is the moderate damage zone, and it could actually go up from there, okay? It could go from 5 PSI up to 20 PSI, because the 20 PSI starts at 3 miles out from the flash point, okay? So as you get closer to the SDZ, it's not going to be like a hard line. It's not going to be, you know, you're at 3.1 miles away and it's, 5 psi, and then you go 2.9 miles away and it's going to be 20. It doesn't work that way. It's going to be a gradual change in psi. So you might be at 5 psi, let's say on the outer edge of the MDZ. You could be at 5 psi over here on the outer edge. And then as you get closer to the SDZ, you could be at, 19, okay? So, and the 20 psi, the severe damage zone, you're talking about a wind of 500 miles per hour, guys, okay? That's how strong the blast wave, the wind from the blast wave is going to be 500 miles per hour, okay? That's stronger than a F5 tornado or F1, whatever the scale is, the strongest tornado, which is like 300 miles an hour. You're talking about double the wind speed of the most powerful tornadoes ever recorded. Okay, so severe damage zone is a very bad area to be. But again, with a 5 megaton warhead, you're talking about only 3 miles out. So as you get further out, these kinds of pressures, overpressures, they start to lessen. Okay, so that's why it's important to think about these things when you're relocating to a new place where you're going to live. You want to figure out where the nuclear target is in the area that you're moving to, and you want to make sure that you're not too close to that target, because if you're too close to the target, you're going to be subjected to, extreme overpressure, okay, 20 psi, 500 miles per hour, okay. Not only, we're just talking about blast wave and overpressure. We're not even talking about the thermal radiation, the ionizing radiation, which I'm going to get to later on in this video, okay. But this is why you want to think about where you're going to be moving when you select your primary residence, your apartment or your house. You don't want to buy a house right here, okay, 2 miles from the nuclear target, okay? You want to be at least in the light damage zone, preferably outside the light damage zone, which is here with the 5 megaton warhead, you're talking 23 miles. Now, there are bigger warheads out there, okay? The Russians have a 100 megaton warhead. So the light damage zone would be much, much further out from the detonation point. And I'm going to show you guys some examples of common warheads that are used right now by the US and China and Russia. And we're going to go through all these numbers so you guys get an understanding of how far away you have to be from the detonation point so you can be safe, okay? But with the 5 megaton warhead, you got to be at least 23 miles away to get away from the light damage zone. Now, the light damage zone, again, it's light damage. So what I want to do now is I want to read to you exactly what to expect from the severe damage zone, the moderate damage zone, and the light damage zone. All right, so I'm going to describe to you what it would be like to be in the severe damage zone after this bomb goes off, or the moderate or the light damage zone, all right? So the best way to describe the severe damage zone is if you look at pictures of 9/11 when the Twin Towers fell, that's what the severe damage zone is going to look like if one of these Chinese ICBMs are detonated, let's say in lower Manhattan. The severe damage zone is going to look like the Twin Towers, but all the buildings within the severe damage zone are going to look like the Twin Towers. They're going to be completely destroyed, okay? That's why it's called severe damage zone. So few buildings will be structurally sound or standing. Very few people are expected to survive in the severe damage zone. Rubble in the streets will be impassable, and there will probably be dangerous radiation levels outdoors due to residual radiation from the detonation. Within the severe damage zone, individuals inside of large structures, such as subterranean parking garages or subway tunnels at the time of the explosion, may survive. So there you have it, guys. Even inside of a severe damage zone, you could survive if you were to go underground into a very deep solid structure, especially subway tunnels or underground parking garages, you might survive. Okay, so keep that in mind. That's a light at the end of the tunnel. Survivors should shelter in place for the first 24 hours. With today's weapons, you can generally expect the severe damage zone to extend 2 to 5 miles or more away from the flashpoint. Okay, and for this one, we have 3 miles. Now, the moderate damage zone, you're going to have substantial building damage, but it's not going to be as bad as the severe damage zone. So you're still going to have your regular residential structures are going to be blown over, because remember, you're going to have 5 psi up to 20 psi winds. So that's between 163 mile per hour to 500 mile per hour wind when that blast wave comes through. So you're going to have a lot of damage, but it's not going to be as catastrophic as the severe damage zone. In the moderate damage zone, you're still going to have some very solid structures that are still going to be standing, but the weaker structures like residential homes are going to be destroyed, okay? So in the moderate damage zone, the big difference you need to know to keep it simple is the moderate damage zone, some of the sturdier buildings will remain intact. For the most part, they're not going to be completely collapsed. There may obviously be windows that are blown out, or maybe the roofs are blown off, or chunks of the building are missing. But for the most part, within the moderate damage zone, the very sturdy structures like skyscrapers and reinforced concrete buildings are going to stay intact, okay? Versus the severe damage zone, those sturdy buildings and skyscrapers are going to be destroyed also, okay? Think about 9/11, the Twin Towers. That's basically what to expect in the severe damage zone. So moderate damage zone, there will be significant structural damage, including blown out building interiors, blown down utility lines, overturned automobiles, caved in roofs, some collapsed buildings, and fires. Telephone and streetlight poles will be blown over. In the moderate damage zone, sturdier buildings, such as those made of reinforced concrete, will remain standing, but lighter commercial and residential buildings will fall or become structurally unstable, and most wood frame houses will be destroyed. Blast damage may generate fires and expose fuel sources such as gas lines and different types of petroleum, potentially threatening mass fires and firestorms. All right, so that's the moderate damage zone. In many ways, the moderate damage zone is actually worse than the severe damage zone, especially when we're thinking about firestorms. The moderate damage zone is going to have a lot of firestorms in it, okay, because you're going to have 163 to 500 mile per hour winds, and that's going to rip apart a lot of fuel lines. Think about, propane tanks getting blown over, natural gas pipes getting exposed to the air, electric lines getting blown over, cars getting tossed around. That's going to cause firestorms. So within the moderate damage zone, there will be a lot of firestorms. But again, just remember, the main difference between the moderate damage zone and the severe damage zone is that moderate damage zone, the sturdy structures will remain, okay? Versus severe damage zone, everything gets destroyed, all right? So if you're in the moderate damage zone, you have a good chance of surviving, because you can even survive the severe damage zone if you're underground. If you're in the moderate damage zone, if you're within a sturdy building, like a multi-story reinforced concrete office building or apartment building, you can survive if you move to the interior of the building or to the basement, okay? So it is survivable, all right? And I'm going to talk about survival techniques in later parts in this series. In this part, we're just talking about the damage zones and what the effects are in the different damage zones, okay? So then we're going to move on to the light damage zone. In the light damage zone, which again is 1 psi up to 5 psi, so between 38 miles per hour and 163 miles per hour, you're going to have Most windows will break with enough force to cause injuries from flying glass and debris. Damage in this area will vary as shock waves rebound off of buildings, terrain, and the atmosphere. Beyond the light damage zone, windows facing the blast may be broken for many more miles, but there will be significantly fewer injuries. Okay, so in the light damage zone, you're going to get a lot of damage to windows, and the wind is going to carry debris. Okay, think about a category 1, 2, 3, 4 hurricane. That's the kind of damage you should expect, okay, because you're talking about between 1 to 5 psi. All right, so you're going to have glass breaking in your home or in your office, wherever you are. The glass is going to break, and there could be debris in the air, 2x4s, pipes, shrapnel of all kinds. That's why they have the duck and cover thing, okay? Back in the day, they did the duck and cover drills. And even when I was a kid growing up in the 90s, I had to do actually nuclear bomb drills. And what we would do is my school, my elementary school, all of the classrooms were facing the outside of the building, and they were facing the windows, okay? They were all around the perimeter of the elementary school, and they were facing towards the windows, and we would do these bomb drills where we would all have to run out of the room and sit in the hallway with our backs against the hallway, and our head has to be tucked down between our knees and our hands holding our head, okay? So that's why they do those drills, and you have the duck and cover drills, because even though you're in the light damage zone, you're still going to experience between 40 to 160 mile per hour winds. So you don't want to be near a window in the light damage zone, because you're going to get cut up by glass and objects, okay? So you want to move away from windows. You want to get to the interior of whatever building you're in and brace for impact, okay? And I'm going to talk in much more detail about how to survive and survival skills and what to expect and all that in later videos, okay? So hold your questions. Wait until I produce more videos, and I'll get into that in future videos, okay? So in the severe damage zone, very few people will survive. Some people within large protective structures, such as underground parking garages or subway tunnels at the time of the explosion, may survive the initial blast. All right, and if we're talking about blast effects, remember in the last video I talked about the 3 main effects of a nuclear explosion. You have your blast wave or overpressure, you have your thermal radiation or heat, and then you have your ionizing radiation, which produces the fallout and also produces an EMP, okay? So I'm going to share some of the effects at the different damage zones, what to expect. So for the blast, few, if any, buildings are expected to be structurally sound or standing. Approaching ground zero, all buildings will be destroyed, and the streets will be impassable due to rubble, which can reach 30 feet in depth, okay? So you're going to have 30 feet or more of rubble, okay, getting close to the detonation zone. And for radiation, those outdoors at the time of detonation in the severe damage zone will receive a lethal dose of initial radiation. Even those within buildings can receive a significant dose. Underground areas such as parking garages or subway tunnels can protect against radiation. Residual radiation levels will likely be dangerous. Okay, so if you're within the severe damage zone, you're going to get exposed to a very high level of radiation as soon as the bomb goes off. That's known as initial radiation, and I talked about that in the last video, so I'm not going to explain what that is, but you have initial radiation and residual radiation. Residual radiation is your fallout, and initial radiation is the initial pulse of radiation that is released at the time of the detonation, okay? So if you're in the severe damage zone, you're going to receive that initial pulse of radiation that's going to basically give you a lethal dose, okay? You're going to die. Unless you're underground in a deep subway tunnel or some kind of deep basement inside of a reinforced concrete building, then you'll be protected from the radiation. And then you're also going to experience fallout. Now, in the severe damage zone, the fallout is going to land very quickly because you're very close to the detonation point, okay? So fallout is almost going to land immediately within minutes. Within 30 minutes, you're going to have fallout landing in this area. So you're going to have to stay in that subway tunnel for at least 2 weeks before you can come out, because the radiation levels are going to be extremely high here. Much higher than the LDZ or MDZ, okay? So if you find yourself in lower Manhattan at the time of a nuclear weapon being detonated, you want to go to a subway and you want to stay there for 2 weeks, okay? So you got to remember, you're going to be there for 2 weeks. You may get buried under rubble. It may take a long time for you to get rescued. You may have to walk out through the subway tunnels. You know, some of these tunnels can go for miles. Even some of the subway tunnels could be collapsed from the weight of the buildings landing on top. You may get stuck. Some of the ceilings in the subway tunnel may cave in. But if you have to go underground in that situation, let's say you're at your office and you get a message on your phone that there's an incoming missile and you have 30 minutes to evacuate and they're expecting it to hit lower Manhattan, you better grab as much food and snacks as you can from the snack room in your job. You know, grab a whole bag of Snickers, grab your, as much water as you can, and head for the nearest subway. Unless you think you can get out within 30 minutes or whatever the time frame is. If you think you can get out of that area, I would recommend it. If you can cover 3 miles or more within 30 minutes, I highly recommend it. You do not want to be stuck in the severe damage zone, because even if you're underground, you're in a subway tunnel or you're in an underground facility of some kind, like the basement of the World Trade Center or the basement of any kind of, office building. You don't want to be stuck there because you're going to get buried under 30 feet of rubble, okay? Just imagine, like I said, the Twin Towers, when the Twin Towers fell. If you're in a subway in the SDZ, the whole area above you is going to look like 50 Twin Towers. Every single building is going to be completely destroyed. It's going to look like 50 Twin Towers, okay? Like 50 9/11s all around you, okay, for 3 miles, okay? So there's no way they're going to come and rescue you in those conditions. You're going to have 30 feet of rubble. All right, think about how much time it took to clear the rubble out of lower Manhattan after 9/11. It took a lot of time. It took months for them just to clear the rubble from 2 buildings, okay? 2 buildings that fell. It took them months, okay? Now imagine 3 miles or even actually 6 miles, an area 6 miles across. That's just every building is like that, okay? It would take them years to clear every single bit of rubble, years, okay? So if you're trapped in a subway tunnel in the SDZ, it's going to be tough, the radiation is going to be very high. There's a good likelihood that you may get cave-ins. Even if you get into a subway, those subway tunnels are very old and they're not made to withstand, 5 megaton nuclear bombs falling on them. They're not made to withstand 100-story buildings landing on top of them. So you may have cave-ins, okay? And you may get trapped in that subway tunnel and die. You may get stuck in there. You run out of air. There's rubble everywhere. There's no water, no food. It'll be like being caved in a mine. It's a bad situation. So you definitely want to try to evacuate, okay? If you get a message on your phone that there's a missile inbound and it's within 3 miles of you, try to put some distance between you and the potential target, okay? Whether it's by going on foot or getting in your car. It may not be practical to get in your car and try to evacuate out of the SDZ, because if we're talking about lower Manhattan, you know what's going to happen when 8 million people get the same message and the message is going to say you have 30 minutes to evacuate the island of Manhattan? You think anybody's going to be able to go anywhere? No. Everybody's going to get in their car immediately and try to drive out, and it's just going to be jammed. Everything is going to be jammed up. And unfortunately, our emergency responders are not prepared for this type of situation because we think it'll never happen here in the United States. Okay, we think that nuclear war is something from, a tinfoil hat prepping movie. It's something that we think will never happen. So we don't have shelters anymore. Our bomb shelters are not maintained. And we don't have evacuation plans. The first responders in a lot of big cities, like New York City, they don't have an evacuation plan. They don't have a way of getting people out of this SDZ. You have to do it. You have to get out of the SDZ yourself. So you have to think about that, okay? You have to sit down, think about what is the nuclear target near me, and am I in the SDZ or am I in the MDZ, okay? And if I'm in the SDZ, what's my plan so I can get out of it and get to safer areas where I don't have to worry about being buried under 30 feet of rubble, okay? Because I guarantee you, you're not going to get out alive from the SDZ. Even though they say that you can survive, of course you can survive. Just like if you talk to miners, the miners will tell you, yeah, you can survive a cave-in. The mine will cave in all around you, and you'll be stuck in this little pocket where there's no cave-in, and you're not going to be able to get out. So you don't want to be in that situation. You want to get out of the SDZ, okay? So thermal pulse. In the SDZ, the thermal pulse is going to ignite fires and cause lethal burns to those within line of sight of the fireball. Okay, so you're going to get lethal burns. Okay, you may even get completely incinerated. You're talking about thousands and thousands of degrees in temperature within the severe damage zone. You're talking about some steel will get melted and warped because of the heat, okay? And right where the flash point is, where the fireball is, the actual fireball is millions of degrees in Fahrenheit, okay? It's as hot as the sun, okay? So anything that touches the fireball is going to be completely vaporized, all right? But outside of the fireball, the temperatures are going to rise to a few thousand degrees, okay? It's going to be hot enough to melt steel, all right? Think about 9/11, guys. It was hot enough from the explosion of the fuel of 2 airplanes to melt steel. What is a 5 megaton bomb going to do? Okay, think about that. So you don't want to be outside. You want to be underground. If you are unfortunate enough to have to shelter in place, in the SDZ, you want to get underground because you're going to be basically incinerated. You're going to get lethal burns. However, the only good thing about the SDZ is that the blast wave may actually prevent the firestorms, okay? Because the blast wave is going to be so strong, it's going to just completely level everything. Versus the MDZ, it's going to be like kind of medium, okay? The blast wave will be like medium strength, and it'll level certain things, but it won't level other things, and it'll expose a lot of pipes and things like that can catch fire. Now, the EMP damage within the severe damage zone will damage and disrupt electronic equipment. Some commercial band AM/FM radios will still be able to receive signals from transmitters outside the area. The power will be out. That's obvious. Now, within the moderate damage zone, there's going to be many casualties, but they're going to survive and they're going to benefit the most from urgent medical care when compared to the SDZ, okay? So the MDZ, this is where most of the medical care is going to be focused on, okay? Urgent care, all right? Our first responders, our government, hopefully if they're still intact, they're going to focus their efforts on the MDZ because the SDZ is going to be so destroyed, it's not even going to be worth it. They're still going to try to help people there, but they're going to focus their efforts here because here you can actually save people versus the SDZ. It's going to be hard to save people, okay? A number of hazards should be expected in the MDZ, including elevated radiation levels, downed power lines, ruptured gas lines, unstable structures, sharp metal objects, broken glass, toxic dust, from collapsed buildings, think 9/11, ruptured fuel tanks, and other hazards. Visibility in much of the moderate damage zone may be limited due to dust raised by collapsed buildings and smoke from fires. Think about 9/11, the areas outside of the Twin Towers, you had all the smoke and the soot and the dust. All of lower Manhattan was covered in dust and you couldn't see and breathe. Water infrastructure may be damaged, limiting firefighting operations. Okay, so water mains could be damaged. If there's water mains and water pipes, there's not going to be a place for the firemen to hook up their fire hoses. They're going to have to suck water out from a lake or something like that in one of their pump trucks. So that's going to slow down the response to the fires in this area, okay? Because the firefighters are going to have to fill up their trucks, and furthermore, the radiation is going to be unsafe for the firemen to work. They're going to have to wait at least 2 weeks for the radiation to subside before they can actually go in and start rescuing people and start putting out the fires, because the firemen will all get killed, okay? So that's another thing to keep in mind, is that the radiation from the fallout is going to be very dangerous in the moderate damage zone and the severe damage zone. The radiation will be less in the LDZ, but it'll also be pretty high. So don't expect the firemen to come and save you anytime soon. Okay, once you're sheltered in place, if you're in any of these zones, SDZ, MDZ, or LDZ, don't expect the first responders to come very quickly. All right, they're going to have to wait for the radiation to subside before they can go out and put the fires out and look for people, because then they're going to die. All right, so you're on your own. Okay, if you're in the SDZ, you're in the MDZ, you're in the LDZ, you're on your own. Okay, the police, the fire, Homeland Security, FEMA, they're not coming. Okay, they have to wait until the radiation subsides before they can go in, because then they're all going to get sick and die. All right, I don't care what kind of suits they have. There's no radiation suit that will allow you to work for extended periods of time in the SDZ or the MDZ. All right, the radiation is going to be way too high, and they're going to have to wait at least a few days, at least 2 to 3 days, for the radiation to come down enough to a level where it's safe enough for them to go out and start to look for people. And even when they go out to look for people, after the first 2 or 3 days, when the radiation comes down to a little bit more moderate level, it's still very high, but it's not high to the point where you can't go outside at all. You can go out with protective suits on, but you can only go out for 30 minutes a day or an hour a day, so they're going to have to rotate the firemen. The response is going to be very slow, so you have to keep that in mind, okay? Nobody's coming to rescue you, all right? There's no 911. You have to fend for yourself, okay? At least 2 weeks. You have to be prepared to shelter in place for at least 2 weeks and be able to fend for yourself. Food, water, security. You got to be able to do that for yourself, all right? So the blast damage within the moderate damage zone, you're talking about buildings will have significant structural damage and blown out interiors, downed utility lines, overturned automobiles, caved-in roofs, collapsed buildings, and fires. Sturdier buildings, such as those made of reinforced concrete, will remain standing. However, other commercial and multi-unit residential buildings may have fallen or be structurally unstable, and many wood frame houses will be destroyed. Substantial rubble and disabled vehicles are expected in the streets, making evacuation and vehicle passage difficult or impossible without street clearing. Closer to ground zero, rubble will completely block streets and require heavy equipment to clear. Now, the radiation within the moderate damage zone, for near-surface detonations that generate fallout, you're going to have dangerous levels of radiation, okay, like I mentioned, and the initial radiation pulse may cause a significant radiation dose that stand outside to people who stand outside during the detonation, okay? So you're going to get also a high initial radiation pulse in the MDZ, just like in the SDZ, okay? And obviously the fallout will be high as well. So the thermal effects in the MDZ, you're talking about a thermal pulse that will ignite fires and cause lethal burns to those within the line of sight of the fireball. Fires will be a major concern in the MDZ. Depending on weather conditions, these fires can spread quickly and coalesce into a firestorm. Okay, so you may get firestorms here, okay, within the MDZ. Okay, they may not, the whole area may not burn, but you may get pockets of firestorms. EMP damage, you're talking about upsetting some electronic equipment. However, battery-operated equipment should work after power cycling, which is turning off and then turning on again. Unprotected equipment plugged into wall outlets may be damaged due to power surge. Commercial band AM/FM radios will be able to receive signals from transmitters outside of the area. Power will likely be out in this area. Okay, so this is why you want to have a good radio, an emergency radio. Ham radios are great, but a lot of ham radios don't pick up AM and FM. All right, so if you do buy a ham radio for the purposes of prepping and emergency use, get yourself a ham radio that can pick up the AM and FM bands. Okay, I have a Yaesu V6 or V6R or VX6R, I can't remember. And my radio can pick up the AM and FM bands. Okay, so if I get trapped in the MDZ, I can turn my ham radio on, dial in the AM or FM bands, and listen to see if anybody's going to be broadcasting, okay, and giving me instructions and telling me what the conditions are outside, because they're going to be able to monitor. As soon as the bomb goes off, they're going to wait a little bit of time for the radiation to subside a little bit. Then they're going to go in and try to monitor the radiation and see what the levels are. They actually don't even have to send people in. They have actually vehicles, drones. They can use drones to detect what the radiation levels are. And then they can disseminate that information to the survivors that are sheltered in place. With their radios, they can tell you, okay, the radiation level is at 10 rads per hour. Remain in shelter for a few more days. And then after a few days, you check again and they tell you, okay, you can go outside. The radiation level is down to half a rad per hour. It's safe to go out and get out of the area, okay? So we're going to move on to the light damage zone. Again, light damage zone is 1 psi up to 5 psi, so 38 miles per hour to 163 miles per hour. Okay, you could possibly rupture your eardrums within the light damage zone, possibly. MDZ, at least 50% chance or greater of rupturing your eardrums, and SDZ, obviously you're going to rupture everything there. So light damage zone, area where glass windows can be broken with enough force to injure those near them. Structures will be extremely damaged, but few will experience structural damage. Okay, so there'll be external damage. Think about a hurricane, okay, category 1, category 2, category 3, up to category 5. Between category 1 and category 5, most buildings usually stand. It's just the outside gets ripped up, the roof, the walls, so that's what you would experience in the LDZ, okay? You would experience external damage, but the structures will be sound and the buildings are not going to be collapsing like in the moderate and severe damage zone. Glass windows will be broken over a much larger area, but are unlikely to result in injury outside of this zone, okay? So there will be glass broken outside of the LDZ, but not with enough force to blow shrapnel at you, okay? It's only within the LDZ that you're going to get shrapnel. And the blast damage, the blast will damage unreinforced structures and cause injuries. Most injuries are not life-threatening, and self-care may be adequate. Radiation for the light damage zone, for near-surface detonations that generate fallout, dangerous radiation levels will exist downwind of ground zero, which is obvious because the fallout is going to spread, probably at least 100 miles. fallout will likely take 10 minutes or more to arrive. Okay, so at least 10 minutes for the fallout to start to land. Okay, I think personally, I think at least 30 for this area here, at least 30 minutes, because the fallout will start to land, but it's not going to fully land for maybe an hour or two. It's going to take some time for it to really land. Okay. Initial radiation, the initial radiation pulse is unlikely to cause significant exposure even to those outside. Okay, so this is where you have that huge difference between the MDZ and the LDZ, okay? Just like the difference between the MDZ and the SDZ, all right? If you're in the MDZ, you're leaps and bounds in a better situation than the SDZ, okay? If you're in the LDZ, you're leaps and bounds better than the MDZ, okay? Because LDZ, you're going to have less fires. You're not going to have structural damage. You're not going to have that initial pulse of radiation, okay, which is just a matter of seconds that's going to expose you. Think of an X-ray or think of a CAT scan. It's just an initial pulse of radiation that occurs when the bomb goes off. It's just like an X-ray, okay? The MDZ and SDZ, you're going to be exposed to a high initial dose of radiation unless you're in an adequate shelter. If you're caught outside, you're going to be exposed to that radiation, all right? LDZ, you don't have to worry about that initial pulse. It's not going to really give you much radiation exposure. Now, for thermal effects, the thermal pulse can ignite fires and cause lethal burns to those within line of sight of the fireball in the portion of the LDZ closest to the detonation. So if you're over here, okay, you're still within the LDZ, but you're getting closer to the MDZ. This is where you can experience, you can still get third-degree burns here, okay? You could burn a whole chunk of your body, and that'll be enough to kill you because you're going to get infections, you're going to get shock, okay? If you burn more than 25% of your body, you get a shock from that, okay? And you can die, all right? So if you're closer to the moderate damage zone, you're going to possibly get lethal burns if you're within line of sight of the fireball, meaning you can actually see the fireball. There's nothing in the way. There's no buildings in the way. You're out in the open and you can see it, okay? So fires will be a major concern in the LDZ depending on weather conditions. MDZ fires can quickly spread into the LDZ. All right, so depending on the weather, these firestorms can jump into the LDZ, okay, depending on the weather, okay? So that's something to think about. So now I'm just going to share with you guys some more detailed information on the blast wave and some of the other nuclear weapons out there that are deployed and what the distances are that you need to be safe and not be exposed to high levels of radiation, thermal radiation, ionizing radiation, and a very strong blast wave. All right, guys, so I want to talk to you a little bit more about blast. There's some important concepts you need to understand about blast. So after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, when the United States dropped 2 atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which were airbursts, and I talked about the difference between airburst and surface burst in the last video in part 3. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they found that just a pressure of 8 psi, an overpressure of 8 psi is enough to completely destroy all wood and brick houses or brick structures, okay? So that's something to keep in mind, all right? So I want to talk to you guys a little bit more in detail about the blast wave and what to expect from the blast wave, all right? So here I have a drawing of a fictional city. This could be whatever city you want. And here we have the fireball. This is the detonation point. And here we have the blast wave. Okay, the blast wave comes out in all directions. Okay, 360 degrees. Okay, so the blast wave will radiate from the fireball, from the detonation point, in all directions. Okay, it's not just one direction, it's all directions. It radiates outwards. Okay, kind of like if you drop a stone into a pond, the waves ripple out in 360 degrees away from the stone that you drop into the pond. Okay, it's the same thing. Now what's going to happen is you're going to have two blast waves. You have your primary blast wave. Okay, that's the one that most people associate with the blast wave. And then you have your reflected blast wave. Okay, this is something that not a lot of people know about. And together, the primary and the reflected wave create the Mach stem. Okay, it's known as the Mach stem. And that's the traditional blast wave that people think about when you see in movies. They show the blast wave coming through. Okay, that's actually the Mach stem. And that's the primary and the reflected blast wave coming together into one giant wave. Now, what's the difference between the primary blast wave and the reflected blast wave? So if we look at my little sketch here, okay, you can see the blast wave is going out in all directions. So this right here, okay, where my this X is here that I just drew, this is the primary blast wave. Okay, this is primary, all right? This is your primary blast wave, all right? This is the main blast wave that comes out from the explosion. Then you have the reflected one. You want to think about the reflected blast wave as kind of like a ricochet, or kind of like if you think about that puddle, okay, or that pond, and you drop a stone into the pond, okay? What happens when the waves start to hit objects that are in the pond or on the shoreline? The waves bounce off of that and they create new waves, okay? Kind of like a ricochet. So think of the reflected wave as a ricochet. So what happens is when this blast wave hits the ground, okay, down here, you can see the blast wave is getting close to the ground and it's moving down to the ground. What's going to happen is it's going to create another secondary wave, okay? Because the blast wave is going to reflect off of the ground, kind of like a ricochet. So you're going to have this primary wave coming through, and then you're going to have the reflected wave, okay, which will be a new blast wave, which I'll show right here. Okay, this is the new blast wave. This is the reflected wave. So this one is going to come through, the primary wave, and then right behind it, you're going to have the reflected wave, okay? And then they're going to actually combine together into one massive blast wave, and that's the Mach stem, okay? Now, if you're close to the detonation point, like if you're in the SDZ, you might actually experience both of these blast waves. You might experience the primary wave as it's coming through, and then you may also experience the reflected wave. Like if you're, let's say, in this building over here, you know, let's say you're underground, this building has a basement, and you're sheltering in place with your coworkers. You're going to experience the primary wave, and you're going to experience the reflected wave. Okay, you're going to have two blast waves to deal with. Outside of that area close to the detonation point, the reflected wave will eventually catch up to the primary wave. Okay, they're going to actually merge into one, and initially, because the air is going to be superheated, okay, you're talking about thousands of degrees, okay, around, like I said, around this fireball, you're talking about thousands of degrees of temperature here. And because it's so hot, this blast wave is going to move through the superheated air at very high speeds, okay? But it'll eventually start to slow down once it gets away from that zone of superheated air, which is probably just around the SDZ, the severe damage zone. That's where you're going to have that really, really high temperature where you're going to be able to melt steel and completely vaporize things. Outside of that, the blast wave will slow down to the speed of sound. Okay, so the blast wave is going to be 600 miles per hour, roughly, okay, after it gets out of this initial area where the detonation point is, where you have the very high temperatures, okay? So you're going to have, the blast wave will travel many times the speed of sound through the superheated air, which is in the immediate vicinity of the detonation point, most likely around the SDZ. And then once it gets to the MDZ, it'll slow down to 600 miles per hour, and then it'll slow down from there, okay? As I mentioned before, it'll slow down to 294 miles per hour once you get into the MDZ, and then out to the light damage zone, you're going to be down to 38 miles per hour. So you're only going to have a few seconds to take shelter from the blast wave, okay? Depending on the size of the bomb, and also you could have reflected mini reflections inside of the city here. These buildings will actually provide cover, okay? So if you're out in the open, you're going to get more of a blast wave than if you have a building in front of you. If, let's say, you know that the bomb is going to blow and you put a building between you and the detonation point, if you see that flash, as soon as you see the flash, you try to get behind something. You try to get into a ditch. You try to get into a culvert. You try to put a building between you and the flash, because if you're out in the open, you're going to get hit by the full power of the Mach stem or the primary and reflected waves, okay? So you want to put some buildings between you and the blast wave. Better yet, get underground, okay? But if you have some buildings between you, it'll provide you some cover, okay? But you can expect within a fraction of a second, if you're in the severe damage zone, within a split second, you're going to experience these blast waves, the primary and the reflected. You're not going to have, it's going to be like half a second, okay? It's going to be immediate, all right? But once you get further out, you get to the moderate damage zone and the light damage zone, you're talking about several seconds before you get that blast wave, that Mach stem, okay? Before you get the Mach stem, you're talking about 4 seconds or greater, sometimes up to 10, 20, 30 seconds, but usually not more than 30, okay? But expect between 5 to 10 seconds before this Mach stem hits you if you're outside of the SDZ, okay? So you want to take cover. You want to protect yourself from that blast wave, okay? Now also, you have 2 phases to a blast. You have a positive phase and then you have a negative phase. All right, so the positive phase is these arrows here, okay? That's going outwards, radiating outwards from the detonation is your positive phase. Then you have your negative phase, okay? It's kind of like a tsunami, all right? In a tsunami, you have the positive phase of the tsunami, and that's usually what does most of the damage, is the positive phase. And then after that water goes inland, after the tsunami, the water starts to retreat back to the ocean. And that's basically the same exact thing that happens with a blast wave. You have your positive phase, which is your main Mach stem and the main pressure, okay, the 20 psi or greater. That's the positive phase, which is this in this direction, radiating outward, okay? This is the positive phase. And then the negative phase, there's going to be sort of another blast wave that goes back towards the detonation point to fill the vacuum that was created, okay? But that's going to be less damaging. 90% of the damage will be from the positive phase, okay? But you can get damaged in the negative phase. You can get injured. Things can get damaged, so you still want to take cover when the negative phase comes back, and the negative phase will be a couple of seconds after the positive phase, okay? So just remember, you're going to have your primary wave, your reflected wave, and that's going to be close to the detonation point. You're going to have to deal with both of these. Outside of the severe damage zone, you're going to have the Mach stem, which slows down to the speed of sound, and then it slows down as it goes further out, but you're going to feel this Mach stem within at least 4 to 10 seconds. If you're in the MDZ or the LDZ, if you're in the SDZ, you're talking about a split second before you feel the primary and the reflected And if you're in the SDZ, you probably feel both of these, okay? So just remember that, guys. This is a very important concept. And remember, you have the positive phase and the negative phase. So even after the wave comes through, you want to remain sheltered in place until the negative phase passes, okay? And I'm going to talk about how to shelter in future videos in the series. So be patient, and I'll talk about that in future videos. Remember, wood and brick structures in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed by just 8 psi, okay? Brick structures were completely destroyed, completely, okay? I'm not even talking about a little bit left. 8 psi was enough to destroy wood and brick structures, okay? So keep that in mind. So even if you're in the MDZ, you don't want to be in a residential house in the upper floors. You want to get underground, okay? Underground is the name of the game when it comes to surviving nuclear war. Absolutely essential. You have to get underground. The ground will protect you. Going underground will protect you from everything, from the blast, from the thermal pulse, from the initial radiation, from the residual radiation, from the EMP. You have to go underground. It's absolutely essential that you find some kind of underground location to shelter in, okay? Now, if you live in an area that could potentially be a nuclear target, like New York City or a nuclear silo base, and I talked about the main nuclear targets, the primary nuclear targets, I identified them in part 2 of the series. So if you want to go back and refresh your memory after you watch this one, you can go back and watch part 2. I list all the major nuclear targets in the country, the primary nuclear targets, all right? So if you live close to a nuclear target like Lower Manhattan, okay, or an ICBM base in the Midwest, and you live there or you work there, like let's say, for example, you work in Lower Manhattan, okay? You have a stable job there, you go there every day. It would be very smart for you to figure out if there's any underground locations close to your job that you can get to within a few minutes, okay? Think about where there's the nearest subway tunnel, where you have underground parking garages, okay? Also, obviously, think about evacuation because, like I said, you don't want to be in the SDZ because you're talking about extreme damage, 30 feet of rubble, 2 blast waves to deal with. All right, survival in the SDZ is going to be very difficult. Even if you're underground, it's going to be like surviving a caved-in mine. Okay, it's not a situation you want to be in. So think about evacuation, but if you can't evacuate, identify not just one location that you can shelter, but 2, 3, 4, 5 locations and have them mapped out. Memorize where they are so you can get to them reasonably quickly without your cell phone, without maps. You should be able to just walk there using your own memory, okay? Locate some kind of sturdy underground garage, some kind of subway tunnel nearby, and locate at least 2 or 3, because what if you can't get to one of them? What if there's people there and it's closed and it's crowded and everybody's already there and you got to find another one? Or whatever the situation is, you want to have multiple options within a close distance, because like I said in earlier videos in the series, you may only have 15 minutes to evacuate, okay? If there's a submarine, a Russian submarine or a Chinese submarine with nuclear warheads on it and it's in the Atlantic Ocean and they launch nukes into Lower Manhattan, you're only going to have a few minutes, okay? Depending on how close that sub is, you may only have 5 minutes. If it's right off the coast of New York City, you may only have 5 minutes, okay? So that's something to think about, okay? So now we're going to move on to thermal radiation. I'm going to talk to you guys quickly about burn injuries. You have first, second, third, and fourth degree burn injuries, and you need to become familiar with them because that's what you're going to experience if you're surviving a nuclear blast. Okay, first degree burns are affecting only the outer layer of the skin. That's the epidermis. They're known as a superficial burn, and long-term damage is rare. Second degree burns are partial thickness burns that involve the epidermis and some of the dermis, okay? And then you have third degree burns, which are full thickness burns. They burn the entire epidermis and the dermis, and they basically destroy all the subcutaneous tissue, okay? So the burn site of a third degree burn will look white or blackened and charred, okay? So a third degree burn is very bad. You don't want to get a third degree burn. It is survivable, okay? Third degree burns are survivable, but you're going to need medical attention because they can get infected, okay? So, and then the worst one is fourth degree burns, which burn through all the tissue. They burn all the way down to your bone, and they may burn even your bone, okay? They destroy all your tissue, all right? All right, guys, so now I'm going to share with you some of the most common nuclear warheads and what to expect. So here we have the 100 megaton Status 6. I've talked about the Status 6 before. That's the underwater nuclear torpedo that Russia has, and they recently deployed it a few months ago, and it's now patrolling the ocean, okay? They have several of these Status 6 Poseidons, and they're basically a giant nuclear weapon, 100 megaton warhead, and it can patrol the ocean. It's basically an underwater drone, and it's powered by a nuclear reactor, and it has this massive warhead, and at any time they can give the instructions for it to swim towards a major U.S. city on the coast and detonate, okay? So I don't think they would actually use a Status 6. I think it's more of an intimidation thing, but they could use it as a weapon of last resort. So for a worst case scenario, let's say they do use a Status 6, it's going to have a fireball of about 3.8 miles in the radius. So 3.8 miles from the detonation point, you're going to have the fireball. That is just absolutely insane. And remember, the fireball is the area where everything is just completely incinerated. That's the area that's as hot as the sun, okay, or 7.6 miles across, okay? So this fireball is going to be 7.6 miles across. That is just huge, okay? That's like almost the entire island of Manhattan, okay? So the entire island of Manhattan, if they detonated the Status 6 right outside of the Statue of Liberty, the whole island of Manhattan would be completely destroyed, okay? It would turn into a big fireball, and everything inside of it would be vaporized. Then you have your SDZ, your severe damage zone, would be 6 miles or 10 kilometers from the detonation point, or 12 miles across or 20 kilometers across from one side of the SDZ to the other. Your MDZ is going to be 20 miles from the detonation point, or 33 kilometers, or 40 miles across and 66 kilometers across. Your LDZ is going to be 57 miles, okay? So if we're thinking about New York City, for those of you guys from New York, if they detonate a Status 6 Poseidon in New York Harbor, if you live in Westchester or even Putnam County or even Orange County, you would possibly get the light damage zone all the way up there. All right, 57 miles from the detonation zone, or from the detonation point, the light damage zone, or 92 kilometers. So you have to be pretty far away because it's such a massive warhead, okay? You can get third degree burns all the way out to 45 miles away, okay? 45 miles away, you can still get a third degree burn, okay? Or 74 kilometers. And the lethal radiation, okay, that initial radiation that I talk about, that initial split-second pulse of radiation, kind of like an X-ray, which is 500 rems or more. And I'll talk about what a REM is in later videos, and I'll talk to you guys about the radiation terminology and stuff like that. But the lethal radiation is from 4 miles from the detonation point. You're going to get exposed to that lethal radiation pulse, which is like an X-ray, and that's 4 miles out or 7 kilometers, okay? And you will die from that, all right? And the minimum distance to be away from this weapon is 100 miles to not receive a burn, okay? So to get no burns at all, no first degree burn, no second, no third, no fourth degree burn, you have to be minimum 100 miles away. All right, so for, let's say, the New York City example, you would have to be at least as far as Poughkeepsie, New York, okay, in order to not get a burn. That's how far away you have to be if they were to detonate the status 6 Poseidon, all right? Now, if, let's say, we use the New York example, because I'm from New York, 45 miles, you can still get a 3rd degree burn. So if you're in places like Mount Kisco in Westchester County, where all the celebrities live, in Katona and Bedford, that's where a lot of the Hollywood celebs live there, you can still get a 3rd degree burn all the way up there. And again, Poughkeepsie is the minimum distance you'd have to be to not get any burn at all. All right? All right, guys, so now we got the Chinese Dongfeng ICBM, which is currently deployed in the Chinese Strategic Nuclear Missile Forces. This is a 5 megaton warhead, so 20 times smaller than the Russian Status 6, but 5 megatons is still very powerful. So the fireball radius is 1 mile from the detonation point, so the fireball will be 2 miles across. That's still a very big area. Or 1.6 kilometers away, or 3.2 kilometers across. That's the fireball. That's where the region where everything is completely incinerated. Temperatures are as hot as the sun. Severe damage zone, which is 20 psi or greater. You have 3 miles from the detonation point, or 5 kilometers from the detonation point. Then you have the moderate damage zone, 7.5 miles from the detonation point, or 12 kilometers from the detonation point. And the moderate damage zone is from 5 psi up to 20 psi. Then the light damage zone, you have 23 miles from the detonation point, or 37 kilometers. And the light damage zone is characterized by 5 psi down to 1 psi. Okay, so here you have all your PSIs. If you remember, eardrums rupture at 5 psi. There's a 50% chance you could rupture your eardrums at 5 psi. And wood and brick structures are completely destroyed at 8 psi. Okay? And so the 3rd degree burn distance is 15 miles or 24 kilometers. The lethal radiation, the initial pulse of radiation of 500 rems or more, you have to be 1.75 miles or closer, or 3 kilometers or closer, okay? And then the minimum distance that you have to be to not get any burns is 33 miles or 54 kilometers. So that's pretty crazy, okay? You got to be 33 miles away not to get a burn. You have to be 15 miles away not to get a 3rd degree burn. And you have to be 23 miles away not to have to deal with any blast wave, okay? All right, guys, so now we're going to look at the Topol M. This is an 800 kiloton warhead that's deployed by Russia's Strategic Nuclear Missile Forces. And this one would most likely be used to create larger damage if the Russians want to damage a larger area, like a small city or a large military base, or if they want to damage a bunker complex or a large military base. They would use this one because it's a pretty big bomb. It's 800 kilotons, so it's almost 1 megaton. This is a big bomb, okay? The Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were only 30 kilotons, okay? So this is a huge bomb. They would not use this for smaller targets like small bases or individual ICBM silos that are in the Midwest. They would use this larger missile mostly for cities, large bases like, Quantico or Fort Meade, or bunkers like Mount Weather. They would hit them with this missile here, okay, this warhead. So the fireball would be 0.6 miles from the detonation point, or 1.2 miles across, or 2 kilometers across. The severe damage zone, you would have to be 1.6 miles or closer. So it's not as big of a severe damage zone. And this is why I tell you guys that nuclear war is survivable, okay? Because if they drop one of these bombs on Lower Manhattan, you only have to go 1.5 miles away in order to get away from the SDZ. That's the really bad area that I talked about. You don't want to be there, okay? 20 PSI or higher, overpressures, complete destruction, 30 feet of rubble. Only 1.6 miles away, all right? MDZ, 4.4 miles or 7 kilometers. LDZ, 12 miles or 20 kilometers. So as you see, it's starting to shrink now. Once you get down below a megaton, that damage zone really shrinks, okay? The light damage zone is only 12 miles now, all right? That's not that far. The moderate damage zone is only 4.5 miles away, okay? So that's easy to traverse. 5 miles, you could cover that distance quickly if you have a car, okay? Light damage zone, 12 miles or 20 kilometers. Third degree burns, 7.6 miles or 12.2 kilometers, okay? And this is assuming that they detonate this bomb for the maximum effects of blast and thermal radiation, okay? So this will be some kind of an air burst. It's not going to be a surface burst, but they could do a surface burst. If they do a surface burst, it'll be similar numbers here. It's just that the fallout radiation would be different. Third degree burn, 7.6 miles, okay? So that's not that bad now. As you see, it's getting down to a level where you can actually comfortably evacuate, okay, and still have enough time to get into a fallout shelter before the fallout lands. Lethal radiation, the initial pulse of radiation, the X-ray as I call it, 1.4 miles away or 2.5 kilometers, and that's 500 rems or higher. And then the no burn distance is 15 miles or 25 kilometers. So as you can see now, once you get down to these 800 kiloton below a megaton, it's much more manageable, okay? You can survive this. You can evacuate. You can find a safe place to be. Okay, the severe damage zone is only 1.6 miles across. That's very, very manageable. This is why I say nuclear war is survivable, okay? So let's move on to some other weapons now. All right, guys, so now we have the 300 kiloton MIRV RS-24 Sarmat or Minuteman III ICBM. A MIRV is a multiple independent reentry vehicle, and I talked about that in part 1 and part 2. These are smaller warheads that are combined together and put onto a single missile. Usually they have about 10 or 15 of these smaller warheads, and they're targeting smaller targets, and they can hit multiple targets from one ICBM, and that makes these very dangerous because they're harder to intercept. So this is currently deployed on the RS-24 Sarmat, which is a Russian transporter erector launcher missile, and this is currently deployed on the Minuteman III ground-based ICBMs that we have in North Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana, okay? So the fireball radius would be 0.4 miles or 0.6 kilometers, so you're looking at just under a mile across. The fireball will be 1 mile across. Still a big fireball. Temperatures as hot as the sun within that 1 mile fireball. Severe damage zone, 1.2 miles away from the flash point. So as you see, it's getting very small now, 1.9 kilometers. MDZ 2.9 miles or 3 miles and 4.7 kilometers. So that's really small now. LDZ only 4 miles and 13 kilometers. So as you see, it's getting much more manageable now. Okay, 1.2 miles away. That's easy to get away from. Only 3 miles for the MDZ. I mean, you can walk away from that, you know. Third degree burn, you'd not walk, but you'd have to run. You know, you could easily cover 3 miles, and if you're in decent shape, you can cover 3 miles in 30 minutes. Third degree burns, 4.5 miles away or 7.2 kilometers. Lethal radiation from that initial X-ray pulse, 500 rems or higher, 1.3 miles or 2.1 kilometers away. And then your no burn radius, where you're not going to get any burn at all, you have to be minimum 10 miles away or 17 kilometers. All right. So now we're going to move on to the next one and the final one. All right, guys, so finally we have the 150 kiloton MIRV warhead that's currently used in the Russian RS-24 Sarmat, which is the same as the 300 kiloton warhead that I mentioned right before this one. And it's currently deployed as the US W-80 bomb, okay, the W. And one thing I forgot to mention with the 300 kiloton and the 150 kiloton, these are mostly used for targeting smaller targets, okay? Typically, these would be used for damaging ICBM silos, and they would probably drop one of these for every single silo. So this is why living close to the ICBM fields in North Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming is very dangerous, because you have hundreds of those silos spread across, let's say, a 50-mile area in southeastern Wyoming, in Great Falls, Montana, and outside of Minot, North Dakota. You have those ICBM fields, they're about 50 miles across, and they're scattered. They're not all in one small area. So the Russians would have to hit every single one of those silos with one of these 150 kiloton MIRVs, okay? So if, let's say, you have outside of Minot in North Dakota, you may have, let's say, 500 silos. Each one of those silos, they have to hit directly with one of these 150 kiloton warheads. So that's a lot of bombs in one area, okay? If you do the math, 500 times 150, I'm not going to do the math right now. In my head, that's too much math to calculate, but you know, you're talking about several megatons of power from all of those smaller bombs put together, okay? So that's going to create a huge fallout cloud from the radiation. So that's why you don't want to live anywhere near one of those missile fields. You want to be minimum, in my opinion, I would not want to be closer than 200 miles, because the fallout cloud is going to be huge. Because all of those bombs are going to have to be surface bursts. They're not going to be air bursts. Like if they try to hit Manhattan or some kind of city, they're probably going to do an air burst so they can damage the most buildings, which I talked about in the third part of the series, the video before this one. But when they're trying to hit the silos, they have to hit the silo directly, okay, in order to damage it. Because those silos are made of reinforced concrete, and they're specially designed to resist being destroyed by a nuclear weapon. So they're very strong. They're not, you know, easy to destroy. So they have to get a direct hit on those silos, each single one of these 150 kiloton weapons, okay, or the 300 kiloton. Okay, now if we think about comparisons to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the 300 kiloton warhead before this one that I just talked about is 10 times as powerful as the Hiroshima bomb. and this one is 5 times as powerful as the Hiroshima bomb. So they would have to hit each silo directly with one of these weapons, okay? And you're talking about 500 silos in North Dakota, probably about 500 in Montana, and probably about 500 in Wyoming. So you don't want to be anywhere downwind when these things go off, when they hit those silos. You want to be minimum 200 miles away, in my opinion, to get away from the radiation. But I would want to be more than that, actually. But I think as long as you're 100 miles away, you should be in a good position. You don't really have to worry too much, okay? So these are deployed on the Russian RS-24 Sarmat and the US W-80. The fireball is now only 450 meters, okay, or 1 kilometer across, or basically half a mile across, okay? So that's a very small fireball now, comparing to the Status 6 and the Dongfeng. You know, those were several miles. The fireball was 8 miles across for the Status 6, okay? The whole island of Manhattan would be completely incinerated. But now we're talking about a fireball that's only half a mile across. The SDZ is only 1 mile from the detonation point, or 1.6 kilometers from the detonation point. The MDZ, 2.3 miles away, or 3.75 kilometers away. The LDZ, 6.5 miles away, or 10.5 kilometers away. These are small numbers, guys. You can get on a bike. If you have a bike, you can jump on your bike and ride away. If you work in a city somewhere, or wherever you live, you know, you can jump on a bike. You don't even need to get into your car. If the roads are not passable because everybody's trying to evacuate, you can get into a bike and you can cover a good distance, you know, on your bike. You should be able to even get out of the LDZ with your bike. The 3rd degree burn radius is 3.25 miles or 5.25 kilometers. The lethal radiation radius is 1.2 miles or 2 kilometers. And the no burn radius, where you won't get any burns at all, 7.5 miles or 12 kilometers. So as you see, guys, it's very survivable, okay? So you just have to plan accordingly. And in future videos in this series, I'm going to talk about specific ways to fortify your home and how to survive an actual nuclear blast. We're just covering some of the principles here before we get into the survival components, okay? So be patient with me. I'll cover the survival components soon in future videos. But that's pretty much it for this one. And again, I encourage you guys to watch part 1, part 2, and part 3 because I expand on the previous parts. You have to watch the first 3 parts to really understand how this all fits in, okay? So, but that's pretty much it for this one. Thanks for watching. Thanks for your support. Take care. God bless. And don't forget the 3 Ps. Prepare, practice, and persevere.